Hello, I'm John Haskell, Director of the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Welcome to today's Kluge Conversation featuring recent Kluge Staff Fellow, Michael Ratner. Michael competed internally in the library for the opportunity to further his research in his area of specialty, supported by the Kluge Center. The Kluge Staff Fellows enjoy a 6-month sabbatical from their daily jobs to dive into the library's vast collections. Today, Michael is joined by Brent Iacobucci, his colleague at the Congressional Research Service here at the library. They will discuss energy policy in the 21st century, uses and challenges of natural gas. The discussion will look at some of the roles natural gas plays economically in the climate change debate and as a geopolitical tool. Let me introduce our two conversants. Michael Ratner is a specialist in energy policy at the Congressional Research Service, as I mentioned, focusing on natural gas and oil markets. With over 25 years of energy experience spanning both public and private sectors, Michael's worked in various segments of the energy industry, including investment banking, intelligence, project development, mergers and acquisitions, consulting, as well as journalism. He teaches at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, where he received an MA in International Economics and U.S. Foreign Policy. He also has a Master of Science in Mineral Economics from the Colorado School of Mines. Brent Iacobucci manages research on all aspects of energy policy at the Congressional Research Service. He teaches environmental and energy policy with the University of Texas's LBJ School, Washington program. His research agenda focuses on topics such as climate change, biofuels, petroleum refining, advanced vehicle technologies, and vehicle emission standards. Brent has also worked for the Department of Energy here in the United States. I'm going to start Brent over again, Laura. I've already botched a few things about Brent. Did I pronounce your name right, Brent? Just kidding.
That you got right.
Brent Iacobucci manages research on energy policy at CRS. He teaches environmental and energy policy with the University of Texas LBJ School, Washington program. His research focuses on topics such as climate change policy, biofuels, petroleum refining, advanced vehicle technologies, and vehicle emission standards. Brent has also worked for the U.S. Department of Energy, the Alliance to Save Energy, and the U.S. Embassy in Lomé, Togo. A Georgia Tech graduate, Brent has a Master's of Arts in Science, Technology, and Public Policy from George Washington University. Brent, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thanks, John. Michael, you finished your fellowship at the Kluge Center earlier this year. Can you talk about your research, why doing it at the Library of Congress was important, and its relevance to current energy issues?
Sure. Thank you, Brent. So the focus of my research was the evolving natural gas markets and what they may look like in the future, and the role that natural gas may play in the energy transition. It was an excellent opportunity to participate in the Kluge Center Fellowship Program, and they were fantastic with their support, with their knowledge, with their guidance. The library's collection of natural gas materials goes back to the 1890s, and it helped provide context for where we are today. The role of natural gas in the global energy mix is changing, and understanding the historical context is essential for making good policy and for me to help advise my congressional clients.
So in response to that question, you talked about that the natural gas sector is changing. How will that evolution affect the United States, and what does it mean for a transition to a low carbon economy?
So it's been really interesting to look at natural gas from the U.S. perspective, because the U.S. was viewed, particularly in the early 2000s, as a growing natural gas importer. And because of shale gas and other issues, the U.S. is now the largest producer of natural gas in the world. It is the largest consumer of natural gas in the world, and it is a growing exporter of natural gas. As things have evolved in the use of natural gas in the U.S. and globally, the the U.S. has taken on a bigger role in that market. And when even before the U.S. started exporting natural gas in liquefied form as LNG, it had an effect on the global market because of the way our sector is set up. Natural gas is priced against natural gas on a commodity basis, as opposed to oil, which is used as a price marker in other parts of the world. It also put pressure on the way contracts were done. The U.S. has a more open, say, liberal market economy, and that is demonstrated in its natural gas market. And so the role for natural gas globally is changing, and the role of natural gas in the energy transition that many people have been talking about recently is a bit up in the air, because natural gas, although a lower emitting hydrocarbon, is still a hydrocarbon. And methane, the main component of natural gas, is a greenhouse gas in its own right. However, natural gas also plays an important role in most economies, in that it's used in a variety of ways. It is used for electricity generation, it is used for heating, and it's used in industrial processes and things like making plastics. And think about how life would be different if we didn't have plastics. So natural gas, again, is viewed, it has pluses and minuses, and where it falls in the end for the energy transition is still very much up in the air, which is what was one of the drivers of my research topic, to look at the role of natural gas. What are the pluses and what are the minuses of it, and how it may and what role it will play in the energy transition.
So, as part of that answer, you mentioned that in many places natural gas is priced against oil instead of rising or falling on its own. What does that mean for global consumers?
Sure. So natural gas historically had competed against oil in more segments of the economy than it does now. For example, we used to use oil in the US for electricity generation, but we no longer do. But natural gas in that market at least competes against coal. Elsewhere, natural gas is used for heating, and really only in the northeast of the United States is heating oil used in the wintertime. So I think where natural gas, the price of natural gas not being linked to oil, will help make it more competitive and more based on its own economics as opposed to the economics of oil. And so it should create a more efficient market with more logical price discovery. And that market, as it becomes more efficient, should benefit consumers globally. As everything else being equal, prices should be lower than they otherwise would be.
So, unlike other parts of the Library of Congress, the Congressional Research Service works directly and solely for members of Congress and their staffs. How has your research in the fellowship helped you as you return to your work at CRS?
Sure. The fellowship was an amazing opportunity for me to reflect on the work that I've done for CRS over the last 11 years and take a deeper, broader look at the issues that I cover, mainly related to natural gas. The fellowship helped broaden my knowledge. It expanded my understanding of the library's collection, which will be useful in my research. And it's helped me respond more fully to congressional requests. It's also helped me guide colleagues to the library's collection, not only for gas, but for oil and for other commodities that we deal with. And it's just given me a much better understanding of the resources that I have available as a CRS analyst.
Oh, that's great. So you talked about the international nature of natural gas consumption. Russia uses its natural gas supplies and infrastructure as geopolitical tools. How will a shift to a global natural gas market from existing regional markets affect things like the conflict between the United States, Germany, and Russia when it comes to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline?
That's a really interesting question, and a question that I've been dealing with over a number of years. Russia, I would say what's interesting is Russia does not mess around with oil markets the same way that it does with natural gas markets. And that's because oil markets, no pun intended, are much more liquid. And price, and there's a global price for oil, and the market will react to any disruption fairly quickly, usually in a matter of a couple of days or a couple of weeks even. So you don't see Russia and other bad actors really trying to mess around with oil markets. Where in natural gas, they have much more influence because natural gas is still much more of a regional commodity. And so, most natural gas that's produced in the world is consumed either in the country that produces it or at least in the region that it's produced in. And only about a third of natural gas produced is actually traded globally. So actors such as Russia can have a bigger influence on gas markets than it can on oil markets. Because in some cases, particularly in Europe, where Nord Stream 2 would be sending gas from Russia directly to its largest consumer, Germany, bypassing certain transit states, but also Europe there are some European countries that are relying on Russia for 100% of their gas. And so if Russia decides that it wants to extract a favor or something from them, they can use gas as leverage over those countries. And so the European gas market, for me as an analyst, has been really interesting because you have gas coming in from multiple places, plus you have the geopolitics that we've seen play out with Nord Stream 2.
So global liquefied natural gas, or LNG, shipments are growing. Can LNG, especially from the United States, address global supply concerns? For example, could U.S. LNG replace Russian pipeline gas to Europe?
So the short answer to that is no. However, as I said earlier, U.S. exports of LNG in particular have had big effects on the market, including Russia and Europe, in how the gas is priced and sold. And so, for example, the reason I say U.S. LNG cannot replace Russian pipeline gas is that, Europe uses natural gas and needs all the natural gas it can get, particularly in the wintertime. So if you look at the data, European LNG import terminals are only in operation for about 25 to 30% of their capacity over a year. However, in the wintertime, they're at 100% capacity. And so Europe needs all the LNG it can get in the winter as well as the pipeline gas. And that's why when Russia decides to, if you will, play games with European gas, it's in the wintertime, particularly if it's a cold winter. And that's a big question coming into this winter is how cold will it be? If it's really cold, then Europe definitely needs Russian gas and a lot of it. And we see prices right now in Europe as very high, in part because Russia has not increased its gas, as well as many other reasons. But that's one of the things that's affecting European gas prices. That said, as I said, U.S. LNG exports, in not only being oil linked, but they also tend to be shorter term contracts. They also don't have what are called take or pay clauses, meaning a company has to take the gas whether or not they use it. And U.S. gas itself is very price transparent. So companies that are looking to import natural gas from the United States can look at the U.S. Mercantile Exchange and find out what the price of gas is, and they can buy at that price and then pay the additional costs for transportation and liquefaction to get the gas to Europe. So in the short term, U.S. LNG cannot replace Russian gas. However, there are certain things that Europe could do when it comes to infrastructure to make natural gas more competitive, particularly LNG. As I said, Europe has a lot of LNG capacity, but there are still strategic locations where it could benefit from having another LNG terminal or a gas storage terminal, and things like that, and pipelines that reach more areas and can reverse their flow in order to bring gas to where it's needed to mitigate the risk of a Russian cutoff, or other geopolitical issues.
As you mentioned, part of the research you did with the Kluge Center involves searching through the physical stacks in the Jefferson Building. What was the most interesting or surprising thing you found?
First, I'd say the opportunity to wander the stacks of the Library of Congress is one I'll never forget. It was fantastic. I literally spent the first 2 weeks of the fellowship just walking up and down the energy stacks, and they were separated on 2 or 3 floors in different locations. And basically all I would do is walk up and down the stacks, turn on the lights, pick a book off the shelf, sit on the floor for about a half hour reading it, and then put it away and find another one to look at. As I said, the library's energy and natural gas resources go back, before the 1900s. And, the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things that I found in just kind of randomly reading materials that were on the shelves, was a lot of the issues today were also in debate back then. Production, supply, demand, prices, and the environment as well were all big issues that were being written on in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. For me, more of my research focused on the late 50s and early 1960s, and that's when LNG was starting to become a commodity and a way of transporting natural gas to markets. And then I got to look at in the 70s when it became bigger and much more global, and the 80s. And so that has provided good context for my work in looking at how natural gas markets are evolving and the role that LNG plays in making LNG a more global commodity that's more efficient and has price transparency and can become a bigger part of the energy mix.
So you said that some of those collections in the stacks go back to the early 1900s or before. So in the last 25 years, arguably the biggest change in natural gas has been the advent of shale gas in the United States and our rapid shift from net importer to a major producer and exporter. What about looking back 50 or 100 years? What's changed the most over that time?
Sure. I would even venture to say that shale is one of the most significant energy events of the last 100 years. Daniel Yergin, the Pulitzer Prize author of the book The Prize, which is a compilation of the history of the oil industry, even cited shale gas and shale development as the most significant event of our lifetime. That said, particularly in the U.S., where shale has really grown, particularly in comparison to other parts of the world, it's moved the U.S. from a growing importer to a growing exporter, not only of natural gas, but also of oil and natural gas liquids, things like ethane and propane. It's really kind of had a big effect on our economy and shows what innovation and market dynamics can do. And that was one of the things that I think struck a lot of the rest of the world when they saw the U.S. basically in a couple of years go from a growing net importer of natural gas to a growing net exporter of natural gas. And that has an effect in the way that the U.S. views commodities, the way that the U.S. natural gas market is set up. All of those things have an effect on the rest of the world. Additionally, it prompted more technological innovation when it comes to natural gas. One of the things that when you look at shale in particular is back in 2008, 2009, when shale gas was coming to market, people said, oh, it can't be produced for under $8 a million British thermal unit. And then that price dropped to $6 and U.S. production kept going up. Price dropped to $4, U.S. U.S. production kept going up. Prices dropped below $2 and U.S. production kept going up. And so you may not see it as much, but the technological innovation that the industry showed to become more efficient in how it produced shale and allowed production to continue to rise, to me, is one of the most significant events of the last 100 years. I think going forward, you'll hopefully see that same dynamic. And I think we have seen that same dynamic more on renewable energies as the cost of solar and wind have come down, as the industry has become more efficient and more cost competitive. You see the use of renewable technology basically now taking on natural gas as the low price commodity for energy.
So jumping off from that, what changes do you see on the horizon for natural gas?
Sure, I think in the short to medium term, in particular, you'll see natural gas continue to become a more global commodity, where gas and LNG cargoes are moved to the highest price point, and companies are able to capture any arbitrage opportunities because there'll be so many ships on the water moving the natural gas. You'll have more consuming countries. You'll have more use of natural gas around the world. So I think on the one hand, you'll see it become more and more of a global commodity. However, I think there's still a big question mark when it comes to natural gas, because people seem to be on the fence of, is it a net benefit for the environment or a net detriment to the environment? Because as I said earlier, natural gas, which is predominantly methane, is a greenhouse gas. And then you have associated natural gas and CO2 emissions. So it's still affecting, or still part of the climate change debate. And I think some people, or I should say the jury is still out of whether, how big of a role natural gas will play in the global energy mix going forward.
Well, Michael, this has been a great conversation. Thank you very much for taking the time. I'm glad your staff fellowship with the Kluge Center was so successful. And I want to thank the Kluge Center for giving you that opportunity and for giving us the chance to talk today.
Thank you.